Oh, I love telling stories, so that's what I'm going to do. I told you last week, I'm going to tell mission stories until we have to leave. Well, until we have to go in there, or get to go in there, I guess I'd say. That one song, that line in there, I think it's, I Bring You More Than a Song. Is that the first song that we sang, I Bring You More Than a Song? And when I think about people who have done mission work in different places, could be as close as a downtown center in a place like Portland or San Francisco. It could be someplace all the way around the world in the other side of the globe. But these are people that have done more than just bring a song. Pretty easy to sing a song. It's a little bit more difficult when you get on a ship back in the old days or an airplane now and fly to some place that you have no idea what's facing you. And that's what a lot of people have done. Both in the Alliance, which of course is our mission, and then all different kinds of mission agencies as well. So, here are my stories. These are the ones I've chosen, and we'll see how far they go. I want to take you back 75 years, roughly 75 years. And some of you know that when Simpson University, as it's now known in Reading, started out, it was called Simpson Bible Institute. And it was in Seattle. I'm going to drop these things. I guess I'll do it this way. I have to shuttle back and forth. Simpson Bible Institute in Seattle, actually this church had a number of pastors back in the early days from Simpson Bible Institute, including friends of ours, Frank and Ruth Mayo, and Ian Hoover, I think, was pastor here, and he was out of Simpson Bible Institute and so forth. A bunch of others. I think you probably know more of the names than I do. And when in roughly shortly after World War II, there was a rather tall, very blonde woman whose name was Doris Brome. She graduated from Simpson Bible Institute and a bit later was called to go to China. Now, back in those days, nutrition and so forth being what it was, most Chinese people were probably about 5'5", 5'6". And here she was, this 5'10", blonde woman who stood out like Saul, head and shoulders above everybody else. But she loved going to China, and so she went. Well, you know what happened in China. The communists came along and they started killing people, including missionaries. You may have heard the name John and Betty Stam, who died at the hands of the communists in China sometime before this. Well, Doris, when the people the communists in China began killing people, including missionaries, she wanted to stay. She said, my place is here. And the people in the villages where she was working said, absolutely not. You're blonde, you're tall, they'll take your head off. You need to get out of here. And so, along with many other missionaries, Doris went to Taiwan. Same language group, that is, one of the Chinese dialects at the time called Taiwanese, and then also Mandarin Chinese, which they now is the national language there. When Doris went over there, one of the things that she realized was that as one woman, even though a very outstanding woman, she'd attract a lot of attention, but she was only able to reach a few people at a time. She had the language, but it was her trumpet, by the way, she was a great trumpeter, and she would go into a village and stand there and play her trumpet. People would gather around saying, what in the world's going on here? The next thing you know, she had an audience. But she realized she could have a much bigger audience if she would go on the radio. And so she began an organization which was first called Overseas Radio International, and then later Overseas Radio and Television. Doris Brome started this radio ministry, and she began to realize how great it would be to reach lots of people throughout the island, 14 million people when I was there. Now it's about 21 million that are on the island. And to get to them over the airwaves where she could reach lots at a time. So she did. She began this process. And one of the things she did was teach English. It's really something all around the world, people want to learn English. And so it's a great tool for missions. And you probably know this from other people that have talked about going to different places around the world. You teach English, and in the process, you get to be able to present Christ. So that's what she began. Over a period of time, that mission grew and grew and grew. I ended up there for 14 months in 1971, 72, and taught English on the radio. And just the other day, out of a box that's 45 years old, I unearthed the 1972 lesson book of my lessons that I got to teach on the radio in Taiwan. And it was funny because I hadn't seen this for decades. And I opened it up and I realized there is this picture of me on the front of the cover here where I actually had dark hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a tie, which nowadays is, to me, I don't wear ties unless I absolutely have to. But it was called Junior Studio Classroom. Doris had a senior studio classroom, which she taught to the more intellectual people. Then there was a basic one for people that were just beginning to learn English. And then there's this junior level where people were doing pretty well in English, but they really needed to learn a lot more. But here's the thing. I had not realized until I looked at this, I hadn't remembered, all of these radio stations that we were on, 25,000 subscribers, 25,000 listeners out of about 2,500 subscribers to this lesson material that was sent out. And Doris did this for years and years and years. I got to do 1 year. These are the lessons that I did the layouts for, but also did the teaching on the radio. Well, I'm going to read you this. Simpson just sent out this in their alumni publication. They said this: this past June, Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, presented Simpson graduate Doris Brome with a Republic of China, that is the Taiwan name, Republic of China, passport, welcoming her after 70 years of ministry as a Taiwanese national citizen. By the way, about 20 years ago, Doris was the very first non-Chinese to be given what in our country we would call the Congressional Medal of Honor. And over there it was a presidential award of some kind to her for her service. She's been over there all of these years, since 1949, when she had to leave the mainland and go to Taiwan. She's never taken a furlough. She's always been there. She travels with the musical teams and so forth. She's been around the world with the choirs that they have and so forth, but she's never taken a furlough in all those years. She dedicated her life. She's a single gal. Dedicated her life. She is now 97, and she still runs that mission. It's really something. So anyway, that's Doris Brome. Now that's a great story just by itself. The Alliance has also done radio ministry, mostly radio ministry around the world. And a couple of years ago, there was a story, I don't know if the tower fell down or what it was, but our radio ministry in Sierra Leone, it only required $1,500. I mean, think about that, $1,500 for them to restore this thing. Here in this country, it would have taken 6 years of government permits and probably 50 grand to get that thing back on the air. But there you go, Alliance Ministry through the radio in Africa. I want to stick with Taiwan, though, for a minute. Some of you know, though I was a very short-termer in Taiwan, I served 22 years at the Alliance Academy in Quito, Ecuador, as a missionary teacher. And that's an Alliance school, was an Alliance school. We had a great reputation with the Asians. Now, most of our students were missionary kids from different missions, and a number of them were diplomats' kids from different nations, English-speaking nations, because the Alliance Academy is an American school, but in Quito, Ecuador. So we'd have these Asian people come because we had, number one, high academic standards, and number two, we had high moral standards. And even the Asians, the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Koreans, who were not Christians at all, still would love to have their kids come to our school because of those high standards. So we said, hey, bring them in. We'll be glad to have them. Many of them from non-Christian families. Now, when a family came in, they would be told very clearly, your students are going to go to chapel. By the way, we had from pre-kindergarten through high school. I taught in the high school, taught Bible. So they would tell the parents, your students will go to chapel, which was once a week. Your students will take Bible classes, because all students do. And so you need to know that they're going to be presented with our message of Jesus Christ regardless. And the parents would almost always say, no problem. No matter what background they were from, they would say, that's great. We're just glad to have our students here. Well, let me tell you about Tony. Now, Tony is not his real name. His real name is Swojia, but he was given the name Tony when he came into an American context. We didn't give him that name. He chose that name, and he's a Taiwanese boy. In Taiwan, when he was 11, 12 years old, he was known as a bit of a bully, from what we're told. He was a fighter. He had a younger brother that he would beat on. And some of you might know what that's like if you have older siblings and you've been beat on a little bit by your siblings. But Tony he had a punch. So he comes into Ecuador with his family, who came there for business. And Tony and his brother were put into our school. Tony was I think a junior high student when he came in, so he would have been about 14. Well, we had he spoke no Spanish, and he spoke Mandarin, and probably Taiwanese as well. It's two different dialects of Chinese. Well, he learned Spanish in the streets, which all of our immigrants there in Ecuador would learn. But we taught English as a second language, and so Tony took our English courses, and one of our courses was Bible for students who needed English as a second language. It was Bible in English for these students. One of our ladies, Carolyn Emirian, missionary with Gospel Missionary Union, was his teacher. And when Tony went through that class, that Bible course, Tony at age, he was a freshman then, at age 14, was confronted with the story of Jesus, and he accepted the Lord. Now remember, salvation is one at a time. You can have a big crusade like Billy Graham used to do and have thousands of people there, but everyone who comes down to pray receives Christ himself or herself. It's always one at a time. Well, Tony was one. And we had a number of students that did that at the academy. But here's the thing. His parents, after a while, who were not Christians, business people, came to Carolyn, his teacher, and said, what has happened to Tony? He's this teddy bear of a guy now, in Chinese terms, whatever the equivalent would be. He's become this loving brother and loving son, and he's considerate. I had Tony in my Bible classes after that, up through his senior year. He had learned enough English. He was doing very well. He was a good student, but his heart had changed. That's a missionary story that I love because I got to see it happen. That's really fun. And there were a number of other students we had at the Alliance Academy that were like that as well. One guy, Larry Wu, was also a Chinese student, came. He was there as a senior the year I got there in 1990. And so I only had him for 1 year. He was in my Bible class for 1 year. And we had a lot of conversations because he was very determined that he was going to learn as much of the English language as he could because he was going to go to university in the States. So he would be at the soccer games, watching the game on the side. He didn't play soccer. He was watching the games on the sideline. And he had this book, and I walked over one time. I said, what are you looking at? And he said he had all of these vocabulary words. And so as the game was going on, he'd be memorizing vocabulary words. You know, he was bound and determined he was going to be excellent, and he was as a student. But one day, after we had talked a lot, he said, I think I want to follow this Jesus. I think I want to become a Christian. And so I was able at my desk to sit and lead Larry to the Lord. Now, I don't know what happened to him after that because he graduated, he went on to school. I completely lost touch. God knows where he is. But that was a tremendous joy for me. So here we have two things we talked about already. One is radio. Well, three actually. One is radio, One is teaching English as an evangelism tool, and one is teaching school. These are three, so far, ways in which missionaries accomplish what it is that we want to see them accomplish around the world. I love these stories because there's all these different ways. In the old days when I was a kid, I can remember thinking missionaries went over and they would build a little, buildings of some kind in a little village, and people would come to church and they'd become Christians. That's all I thought of. Until I went to Taiwan and got to see what happened with radio, and then talking with other missionaries. By the way, I found out that you could be a missionary pilot when I was about 9 or 10 years old. I never wanted to fly a plane, that wasn't the idea. But it fascinated me that people would actually do missions in small planes. And of course, when I was in Ecuador, I got to fly several times with missionary pilots in these little Cessnas and go out into the jungle areas where they flew. I want to read something that reminds me, if I can find it here, about flying. I should have put these in order first. Here we go. Mission Aviation Fellowship, I'm sure you know about it, at least basically. Their headquarters are now in Boise. Used to be up in Redlands. You'd remember, Don, MAF being down in Redlands. But now they're up in the Boise area. Mission Aviation Fellowship sent out just recently, I'm on their list, so I get these notes of various kinds, and these are a few little squibs. There's an airstrip in Lesotho. I'm not even sure where that is. Is that Africa? Okay, thank you. In Tihanyaku, Lesotho, and with the Ministry of MAF, Mission Aviation Fellowship there was a pastor that came in, was able to share the gospel with workers at the airstrip. One of the things you need to know is that MAF hires locals to do a lot of the work, and in fact they will do what they can to try to hire pilots that are nationals, as well as mechanics and others that are nationals when they are well trained. And so here's a pastor sharing the gospel with workers at the airstrip. Opportunity wouldn't be there if MAF was not there. In Indonesia, MAF just recently was able to transport 3 professors who are teaching Bible school lessons in Kampung Baru in Kalimantan. You may have heard of Kalimantan. That's where the Alliance has been involved down through the years. And MAF pilot wrote, "It's exciting to be able to support the work of the national churches." These guys and gals who fly for MAF and work on the planes, they love what they do. And it's very, very exciting. Will and Julie White currently are in headquarters near Boise at Nampa after serving with MAF in Suriname and Haiti. You've been following the news in Haiti lately? It is really, really difficult. And with all of the gang activity and so forth, MAF has been very, very questioning as to what they ought to do in continuing in Haiti. But these people have been there for the last 27 years. And in their last prayer letter, they asked for ongoing prayer for the country of Haiti because of the instability. There's one more about MAF, and this is one of the things about being a missionary that is sometimes dangerous, is kidnapping. Another one is being arrested by the government when you didn't do anything wrong. And there's a pilot and his family called the Kohers, K-O-H-E-R. They're in Mozambique. And several months ago, Ryan, the pilot, was arrested because he transported someone from one place to another in the MAF plane in Mozambique, and somehow the government didn't like that, and so they threw him in jail. Well, I don't know if you realize this. Here in this country, we're considered innocent until proven guilty. But in many nations around the world, you are guilty when you're arrested, and you have to prove your innocence. Ryan and MAF and his family have been trying to prove his innocence for months. They did let him out of jail recently so he can be with his family, but he can't leave the country, and they're trying to work out his permission to leave Mozambique, not to escape from his work, not that, but the idea is he needs to get out so they can stabilize the situation there. We'll see what happens. That's a prayer need. Ryan Koher and his family. So now we have aviation, and we've got teaching English, and we've got teaching school, and we've got radio, and we've got television, 4 different kinds of things. I want to talk a little bit about one of my students at the Alliance Academy whose dad was a pilot for MAF, because this is another form of ministry that I really love. Nick was a freshman at the Alliance Academy. He's 14 years old. His dad was flying down in the jungle, so his parents lived down in a place called Shell. And so Nick came up and he lived in a dorm. I talked to Nick's dad and I asked him for permission. If I'm a mentor of young men, I asked him for permission. Can I mentor your son, Nick? Because Nick had expressed an interest in doing that. Well, Nick wasn't particularly strong. I mean, he was a good kid, but he wasn't particularly, strong as a Christian. He wasn't thinking in terms of ministry or anything like that. His big thing was basketball. And he was on the team. He got on the JV team and also then later on the varsity team as he played his 4 years at the Alliance Academy. One day I was sitting at practice watching just the practice of the team, and Nick came roaring down the court, and he missed his shot, and he said something he shouldn't have said. And I was sitting right there, and I said, "Never again." And he looked at me like I'd shot him, like this, because he said something he shouldn't have said. Well, 2 years later, he came to me and he said, we have these junior high school students, and there's this mentoring program for junior high school students. You've been mentoring me. Could I mentor them? And the mentoring program it doesn't matter what the details are, but there were a few of those kids that didn't want to go to the program. And so Nick said, well, let me work with those guys. They're kind of the outsiders, 4 or 5 of them. I said, sure, that'd be great. So he wasn't part of the program, but I mentored him while he mentored them. Nick just finished his graduate work at a seminary in Minnesota. He and his wife and 4 children are in ministry. They've done, in the intervening years, they went to Costa Rica for 2 years to work with the Evangelical Free Church, and then he decided to go to seminary. He's gone to seminary. He's prepping more and more for ministry. I love mentoring, and I love seeing it when one of my guys who was mentored decides to mentor others, which makes me a grand mentor. All right? Kind of like a grandmother or grandfather. That's such a great story. It is such a great thing to see him make the progress that he has. He married a wonderful gal. I told him and Becky when they got married, I said, well, you'll have honeymoon twins. That's how I bless my young men who are going to get married. I said, well, remember, you'll have honeymoon twins. And he just laughed. Well, they didn't. They had 2 kids, and then they had twins. So now they have 4, which he then blames me for the twins. But I love this guy, and there are others that I've mentored as well that have moved on to mentor other people, and it's really very, very exciting. While we're in Ecuador, let me talk about the past. If we go back again to probably the I can't remember the dates, but it would have been sometime in the 40s or 50s. Ecuador is about the size of Oregon. So if you can think of it this way, Quito would be around where Eugene is. And then there's a northern area up around where the Portland area is, but it's rural. And there's an Indian tribe up there, an indigenous tribe called the Otavalans. All right? The Otavalans were an early target for the Alliance. Now, the headquarters were in Quito, the capital city, about where Eugene is, but they would send missionary people up into the Otavalan area to try to break into that indigenous tribe. One man went, I don't remember his name, he was up there for while, I think he and his wife, and there was hardly any response. This happens, as you know, sometimes. There's very resistant, kind of like what I talked about last week. You got the path people, very hard to get the word into them. And that's the way these people were. Well, that couple decided, we can't do this anymore, and for whatever reasons, they left. And then another, I don't know if he was a single man or a married man, but went up into that same region, tried again. Almost no response. Couldn't get a church started, could hardly find anyone to follow the Lord. He left. And of course, the mission is involved in making some of these decisions. Well, we'll take you here, we'll move you to another place in Ecuador that might be more responsive. Then came, never underestimate the power of a woman, Evelyn Richner. And she, if you know the Jaffrey series of books, there is a book about Evelyn Richner and her story of going to Ecuador and going up into that. She's from the Midwest. And she went up into the Otavalan area, and she had hardly any. She just pounded the dirt up there all the time, both in the figurative sense, like last week, trying to get into the path of these people's resistance, but also literally just walking the trails up there. Hardly any response. So the leader of the mission said to her at one point, really, we need to use you somewhere. We want to send you down to the coast, to Guayaquil, out of the major cities. And she looked at the leader of the alliance, her boss, and she basically said to him, she was very short, and he was taller, and she looked up into his face and she said, I'm not done here yet. I am not leaving here yet. Well, the boss knew her, and the boss said, okay. And within a time after that, year or two, I don't know how long it was, all of a sudden there was this breakthrough. And the Otavalan nation, indigenous nation, just opened up to the gospel. And now there are churches and churches and churches. One of my friends is Carlos. He is a pastor in the Agato area up there, and he sends me every few weeks. He will send me pictures of the church events and the new churches that they're planting there. Evelyn's long gone. She retired sometime back in the 1980s. But when they opened a brand new church that would seat 1,000, Evelyn came down from the States, and I was there for the dedication and watched her as she cut the ribbon to this beautiful building that would seat 1,000 indigenous, I think it's 1,000 indigenous people. So, perseverance. These are the people, they bring more than a song. She came with determination. She is not going to let this beat her down. And she stuck with it and stuck with it and stuck with it. And now there are these churches up in that area that are reaching people for Christ. That's Alliance, by the way. That's an Alliance missionary story. Don, you had a story you were going to tell. Why don't you... Yeah, come up and do that. You can stand next to me. That's okay. Anything about missions?
It's about missions.
Yeah. Just stand next to me.
I couldn't find another mic to use. Yeah. As happened a few weeks ago, I brought a letter that my father-in-law, Ross Pinfrock, wrote about how the Lord touched his body. And recently I came across another letter. This is by his wife, my mother-in-law, named Mildred Pinfrock. I won't read all of this, but it shows to me God's involvement in the little stuff, seemingly little stuff, and often missionaries don't talk about this. At least I don't remember hearing anyone do that. So I'm going to break that trend. She started out with an introduction, and then she says, we have big news. Remember what you said about wishing we could find a house. This is for our furlough year, and she wrote this in 1972, about the time you were in Taiwan or shortly after. And anyway, they're looking for we were getting ready for furlough a few months after she wrote this. Remember you said what you said about wishing you could find a house around the University of Redlands area. a fenced yard, etc. Question mark. Remember? I can hear her say that. Well, we've been praying specifically about the right house for you. Last week, it all dropped into our hands in a most unusual way. We can't get over it. God has so wonderfully answered. I won't go into great detail about it, but the house is tied up in an estate probate court deal. The owner, a friend of Ernie Law, and Ernie was a neighbor of my in-laws up in years. Anyway, the owner of the house, who's a friend of Ernie, died in March, just a few months earlier, left no will. The lawyer wants to rent it, and Daddy has been talking to him and asked him about renting it for our returning missionary children in July. He was willing to rent it to you at the amount you are allotted by the mission, $125, can you imagine? Plus, you're taking care of the property. Now, if that isn't an amazing answer to prayer. We had prayed about the amount. It has a fenced-in big yard. We haven't gotten into the house because we haven't yet gotten the key. But since the Lord provided, I feel it will be big enough. That's faith. That's my mother-in-law, too. I believe it is fully furnished. I can tell you more when we get in and look around. The yard is full of trees and looks like a jungle. The lady herself had money, so I think it is a really nice place. And that's a statement of faith, too. The lawyer wants me to go right in and clean it up and take out Ernie's clothes. He was staying there. Ernie had been in an accident and nearly killed. He's recovering now there and will probably go to a rest home. Daddy is involved in helping him and handling his finances, and this is how we know. And he was working with a lawyer regarding Ernie's finances, and that's how this all came together. Then there's a PS, so this was added a bit after what she had written. We just went into the house, and it has a good-sized living room, fully furnished, piano, TV, everything. Dining room, kitchen, den, 2 bedrooms. You can sleep 2, I think, in the porch. It was a sun porch glassed in and used as a den. A couch, a desk, etc. Dishes, pots and pans, silverware. I don't know about linen. I asked the lawyer what to do with these things. He said they can be used. I'd think you'd want to use your own things like bedding, etc. I guess I will pack away the things I know you won't want to be bothered with to make room for yourself, for your stuff, rather. There's also a cellar with a fridge in it with several bottles of wine in it. Also several bottles of wine and liquors in the refrigerator in the kitchen. Thought you'd like to know about those things. And then she has in parentheses, shall I save them? We are going to have to do a lot of cleaning and removing of trash and cut limbs. The kitchen is a mess, refrigerator full of food and milk, etc. I'm going down tomorrow. They lived in a little community called Mentone, which was an elevation a little bit higher, and start to work on the place. The kitchen is dirty and needs paint. I told the lawyer I'd start to care for the place and do the watering. They will pay for the water, you will pay the other utilities. This struck me, again, because God was involved in this before we even knew we needed a place. And it was fully furnished, and we enjoyed that location in an older but very nice neighborhood at the time. Well, still is, I believe. And we just take this as a way of God's blessing and how he blesses missionaries in other ways in their daily lives.
Thanks, Don. The song said, I bring you more than a song, and that's us talking to God. And then God says to us, I'm going to take care of you wherever you go. When I left Simpson to go down to Ecuador, my salary dropped 75%. My dad said to me when I was a kid, he said, never let money decide things for you. And so I moved from Redding, where I was working at Simpson, down to Ecuador. My income went from this to this, and I've never missed a meal. God will provide what you need. That's really specific in that case, and there are many other stories that missionaries will tell you, as well as other people of God, as you know. The missionaries will tell you because God is a faithful God to supply, which I think is, and sometimes through the most amazing circumstances. Speaking of that, Christianity Today, in the most recent issue, has an article about a little church in Washington State. It's a church called the Onecho Bible Church. I'd never heard of it. It's 74 people, 74 members in this little church, have been involved in giving to missions for ever since 1965. This little church has given $25,000 a year on average to missions. They have given $1.4 million to missions since 1965. The way they did it was God has provided for them a field. Now you talk about a mission field. This is a real field. It's an old Mennonite background church. And there was an elder of the church who passed away at age 65. He gave 180 acres to the church. So the church, instead of saying, well, we can sell all this land and have money, they said, hey, we'll work it. So they got $5,500 out of the first harvest. In 2021, the field earned $39,000. That was 2 years ago. Last year, it was $178,000 out of this field. I don't know what they're growing. I'm pretty sure it's not weed. I think it's probably something legitimate. But anyway, but they give this to a variety of agencies, some of them right along the American border with Mexico. And I thought, you know, we talk about these, people will always want to focus on big churches. You know, you have a church of 3,000. Well, you ought to be giving $1 million a year to missions. Wait a minute. 74-member church giving 25 grand a year over and above what they have in their offerings and so forth to missions. You don't need to be big in order to be faithful in giving to missions. I loved that story when I read it. There's a lot more detail to it than just that. What do I have, about 7 or 8 minutes here? I was talking about Doris Brome earlier, the 97-year-old missionary in Taiwan who is still leading her mission. At council, the Alliance Council, Brian was there. That's when he asked me if I'd come up and speak for him. But Brian was there at council in Spokane at the end of May, early June, and they always have. Don, you didn't go. Did you go this year? You didn't go. They always have for what's called Caleb and Company. That's for us retired missionaries. It's a support ministry for retired, what they now call international workers, as you know, instead of the word missionary. But they have a special section during the banquet of all of those retired missionaries who have died in the intervening 2 years. You have council 1 year, 2 years later another council, 2 years later another council. And of course one of those was Suzanne. So they have a slideshow and they show the person's picture or maybe a couple of pictures and then the year they were born, the day they died, and their name. You want to live a long time, you become an Alliance missionary. I'm serious. I'm watching this thing. There were about 50 slides. I think it was 50. It was either 40 or 50. And as they're going along, the birth years, 1927, 1931, 1930, 1934. There was one guy that was born in 1983. He was the youngest one out of the bunch, so he was 40 or 39 maybe when he died. I don't know how. over and over and over. These are people that are 85 and 90 and 95, one of them 100 that had died in the intervening 2 years. Just got the 90th birthday celebration page this last couple of weeks. The people that are still living that are Alliance missionaries. 96, 91, 90, 99, 97, 93, 90, 90, 97, 92, 91, 99, 94, 93, 90, 101, 93, 90, 90. You want to live long, become an Alliance missionary. I mean, it is really something how many of these long-termers, and they'll leave the field at 65 or 70 and then go and they do other ministries in the meantime, like Don here in the church. And it's just terrific stuff. And some of them retire right off the field. I mean, they stay until they are absolutely told, you're done, go home, rest. And they go home and they don't want to rest. You become a missionary, you don't want to rest. I'm retired, quote unquote, but I hate the word. I'll never accept it. And I know a lot of other missionaries who feel the same way. Former missionaries, we say former missionaries, but we're still doing something. And I think that's a terrific thing. I've got a few minutes, and I'll finish up with one of these. Okay, I'll tell you this story, because this is one of my favorites. There's a mission. Have you heard of HCJB? You know that name? It's a mission that has been in Ecuador for many, many years, and it's radio and television, teaching English, but also reaching into the world through shortwave back in the day, and now through satellite communications. HCJB broadcast back into China all those years since the communists took over in 1949. They've been broadcasting into China from outside the nation, obviously. Ron Klein was the president of HCJB for quite some time. He was a lifer with, he's still living, as far as I know, but he was a lifer with HCJB. And he came to speak to us. He was headquartered in Ecuador, so one day he came across to talk to us faculty at the Alliance Academy, which he did often. His kids and his grandkids all went to the Alliance Academy. And he told us a story about a story that had come out of China, where the people there had heard the broadcast of the message about praying for healing with the anointing of oil. Now, the Chinese did not know what that meant. I mean, we understand that. You have a little oil, you dab it on the forehead, or maybe make a little sign of the cross or something like that. You pray for a person, you ask God to heal them. They didn't know what that meant. So the story came out that there was a man who was desperately sick in this little hidden Christian community somewhere in the interior of China. So they thought, so they took, according to what he told us, they took a 55-gallon barrel of oil and dumped it on this guy. From what I understand, he was healed, but also very, very greasy. I love stories like that because it's the faith of the people. You know, the oil doesn't heal. In fact, it probably would have made him sick if he wasn't already sick. But I love stories like that because here are people who are willing to say, I'm going to step out in faith and do something that the Bible tells us to do. Only in their case, they really overdid it. But they were learning. And of course, the message of Christ got into China through not just radio, but through a whole variety of other things as well. Oh, I have one last one. I have about a minute. This is enough. I just remembered this story. Also in China. We had an elder missionary statesman in Hong Kong. He had been a missionary in China. I'm trying to remember his last name. But he, after the communist takeover, he'd gone to Hong Kong and had run the seminary, the Alliance Seminary in Hong Kong. And Bartel was his last name, as I remember. And his son became a missionary also, and was, of course, very interested in ministry to the Chinese. When China began to open a bit, if you remember, back in the Nixon era, and then shortly after that, little by little, Americans could go in to China. Still, of course, nowadays we can't. We just have to be careful where we go and what we say and what we do. Excuse me, I need a cough drop. So the son, who was by now probably in his 40s, also an Alliance missionary, went into China with an associate, another missionary man, and he remembered a particular town he wanted to go to where there used to be an Alliance church before the fall of China to the communists. He went to this. He and his associate took with them 20 Chinese Bibles. Now, when they were stopped at the border, the customs people said to him, well, you can take those in, but you can't leave them there. So when you come back out, you have to come out of China in exactly the same place you went in, and we will count to see that you have those Bibles. Okay, he said, that's fine. I mean, they were just going to go in and use them to read to the people and that kind of thing and encourage them. And he said he got to this town, and he was nosing around, and he recognized the building that had been the Alliance Church. Well, now it was some sort of museum or something like that. The communists didn't allow it to be a church anymore. And so he went, and as he was kind of looking around this building, because he remembered it from when he was a kid, he said he saw this older woman, and she was kind of looking at him, because he's American, and she's Chinese. What's this American doing nosing around this building? So she came over, and she started to talk to him, and realized he spoke fluent Mandarin, so there you go, little conversation. He found out that she had been in that church prior to the fall of communism when she was young. And he said, well, let me pray for you. She was a Christian. He said, let me pray for you. Is there anything that you really need? And she said, I would love to have a Bible, but we can't get them. So he thought, well, Lord, how do you provide a Bible? I mean, they got to have 20 when they leave. All of a sudden, he had an idea. He said, you wait. You're in your little house here. I will be back. All right? So he got a hold of his associate, and they went to their hotel room. They opened up all of those Bibles, and they took 1/20th out of this one, and 1/20th out of this one, and 1/20th out of this one. So they had a full Bible, and all 20 of the Bibles were still there, but each one missing just 5%. Bound those up in a cloth, took them back to the lady, and said, "Here you go." Love that story. There are ways of getting the truth into people's lives. So that's a few of the stories. I have a whole lot more, but we don't have time. We're supposed to have a song now, is that right? Okay.